Welcome you to the fourth session of our series, The Journey Home, Perspectives and Easing the Way. Today we have Steve Presley talking, and he's going to cover the funeral home's perspective.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for inviting me to be with you this morning. I usually start by saying, it wasn't very many years ago that nobody would ask an undertaker to come talk to him. And, I hope you don't feel that same way when I get done. I like to start by telling you a little bit about me first. I'm a lifelong Lutheran. I was raised at First Lutheran Rock Island, as was my mother and my grandmother and my, great-grandmother. She was a young arrival from Sweden. My grandfather came from Sweden, so I was baptized with Swedish water, like many of you. But we will speak in English, I promise. Trigger A is about all I can do in Swedish. Although we're not members at First any longer, about 20 years ago we transferred over to St. Paul's in Davenport, but we're still Lutheran. But I like to say it's because of my old Swedish pietistic forebears that I still have very definite ideas about funerals and worship, and it ain't all bad, really. So with that being said, I became a funeral director in 1977, and after a few years joined Wheelan Funeral Home in 1984, became the co-owner in 88, and then took over its operation in 98. This year, in August, we will celebrate our 125th anniversary of serving families in the Quad Cities, and it's been the Whelans, and it's been me. So we're happy that we're independent, and that I hope that we continue that same legacy that the Whelans established so many years ago in service to families. So with that said, a brief history of funeral service would start with the fact that funeral planning, which is what many of you are interested in, I suppose, goes back to the ancients, to the pharaohs. If you think about the fact, who were the first people to build monuments to themselves? It would be the pharaohs. And so many of them were designing these things long before they died. So we can assume then that the pharaohs were the first to begin pre-planning funerals. I feel like I went back to you, so I can back a little bit. You might be better not to look at me. And then let's jump forward from them several thousand years, and I'm going to, maybe it's a stretch, but I don't think so. I'm going to read a passage from the Bible. And it's from the 15th chapter of Mark, and it begins at the 42nd verse. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate wondered if he were already dead. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. And he bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. And then I won't read the next passage, but in the book of John, the Gospel of John, we read that not only did Joseph take the body of Joseph, but he had help. Nicodemus was with him. And they brought myrrh and aloe, and included that in wrapping the body of Jesus. So I suggest to you, maybe then the most modern funeral directors were Joseph and Nicodemus. And Jesus, in a sense, was embalmed. And so we jump forward now another several thousand years, or maybe 1,500 years, to the days of the Civil War. And there were many parents that were, especially mothers, that were tremendously upset over the death of their sons in the battlefields during the Civil War, and that they weren't able to return them home to be buried in their native counties or states. And so a physician that was fighting alongside the Civil War soldiers decided, we have to determine a way to get our boys home. Just putting them on a railroad car and sending them back and not knowing what condition they're going to be in is not the answer. So he developed modern embalming as we know it today. And that really was the start of funeral service in the United States. At least that's what I would suggest to you. That's really when we got to know embalming and the use of facilities for funeral homes. We went from the homes to the funeral homes. And then we come today, to the 21st century, and boy, a lot has changed. We've changed from having traditional funerals every day, where many of us would see 2 or 3 cremations a year, to suddenly jumping to here in this part of the country, 35 to 40% of our services are cremation. To other parts of the country, like out the West Coast, where it may be as high as 70 or 80%. So the whole idea of what people want in funerals have changed. And with that, and we'll come back and talk about these things, so have the difficulties of dealing with people. The family has changed. How we deal with people has changed. Or how they deal with us, maybe. How they deal with each other. So there are more challenges now than we've ever experienced as funeral directors. Let me talk a little bit about the funeral, if I can. Look at my notes here a little bit. When I started in 1977, a funeral was basically a religious ceremony. A funeral was worship. And probably the hardest thing for me to put my arms around today is that for many it's not. And go back to those Swedish waters of baptism as they soaked into who I was. Worship is worship is worship. And today we'll have families come in and plan their own funerals, and it'll be anything but a worship service. There may not be prayer, there may not be scripture, there might be vulgar words used in the, it's very difficult. And I have to, I guess, bite my tongue, and I do. But as we change, as culture changes, as we become more secular, and that's a whole other class for you to take up. As the world changes, we become more secular, so do our trends. And I would, I guess, admit that the biggest change is when we saw this change to secularized funerals, to non-faith funerals, was with the growth of cremation. And I'm not against cremation, I don't want you to misunderstand me. But as people decided to choose cremation, especially those that were unchurched, it became the most expedient way to dispose of their loved one. And I don't use the word dispose in a negative sense. That's how it's framed on the death certificate. The method of disposition is either burial or cremation. But as families started to choose that, those that were less schooled in traditional Christian values, maybe, decided that, we don't need to quote scripture, we don't need to pray. So that has been the hardest thing for me to see, as society has changed. So, for us, Wheelan-Pressly Funeral Home. My peers tell me that we would be the larger funeral home in the Quad Cities. We do 500 funerals a year. And of that, I would say it changes every year. We're somewhere between 35 and 40% every year of cremation. So that's a big change. And it's a significant change. But it's what society wants, and that's what we do. And there's still obviously the rest of society that, at least our clients, that choose traditional funerals, and so that's, to each their own, and we're glad to do whatever they'd like for us to do. Let me spend a few minutes talking about cremation. In our earlier session, that's where most of the questions centered, and then we'll move on from there. And please, if you do have a question, stop me, because generally I find that I end up doing more question answering than talking. But with cremation, it took funeral directors a while to understand that when families would choose or select cremation, they weren't talking about necessarily us just picking up the body and cremating it. There is a growing trend for families to want a funeral first, or a visitation first, and then to cremate. So that is an option. And for most of us, I would hope most of us, as funeral directors, would provide an inexpensive rental casket for families to do that. Because there's many families that feel the need for closure. They have the body present. Or there's family that isn't here when the death occurs, and the rest of the family feels that need to pay their final respects. So, cremation is just not immediate, although many times it is. And so what is immediate cremation? Another misnomer is that the body is cremated right away, that we go to the hospital, pick up the body, we go to the retort. Not in Illinois. In Illinois, there's all kinds of hoops that have to be jumped. We're very regulated. Funeral homes are regulated by the federal government, we're regulated by the state government, and by the county. So a lot of hoops. When a person dies, number one, if they die in Illinois, we have to wait a minimum of 24 hours before the body can be cremated. And then it can only be cremated if the doctor has signed the death certificate, the coroner has given us a cremation permit, and the county has given us a cremation permit. And the B and C, the coroner's cremation permit, the county's cremation, it's kind of sequential. The death certificate has to be signed first, the cremation permit from the coroner has to be signed second, and then the county gives us their permit, the health department. So, if the death occurs on a Friday night, the chances that cremation will occur before late Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning it's not going to happen. So many people, it's funny, we'll have a family, church, non-church, it doesn't matter, but death will occur Friday afternoon, later Friday evening, they come in Saturday morning, and they'll say, well, we're going to have visitation on Sunday, the funeral on Monday, but we don't want the body there, we want just the cremains. Well, we're not going to have the cremains until the earliest, Tuesday. So, that's something that it's taken a bit of education for families to realize things don't happen quickly. And I was asked this morning if that means we have to embalm those bodies. We only have to embalm in a cremation situation if the body's going to be viewed publicly. Generally, we were probably the first in the Quad Cities to have refrigeration as part of our facilities, so nobody is forced to embalm. They have to request it or okay it. And in fact, embalming is not required at all by the state unless the person has died of some kind of infectious or contagious disease. And so we wouldn't have a public visitation, obviously, if the body was embalmed. So that's the first notion about cremation, that it happens right away, and that's not the case. What are your options with cremation? Well, we talked a little bit about the rental casket, so you could have a traditional funeral. You know, families have memorial services, funeral home, they have them at the church. I'm a great believer and advocate of using the church, family's a member. That's where the funerals belong. They don't belong at the funeral home. And so I've always pushed for church funerals. There's some families that feel uncomfortable at church, so that's their cost, or their call. Cost of cremation. You know, there's a wide range. There's a wide range of costs. I usually say a cremation today is costing somewhere over $2,000. And you have to figure in, you know, all of the overhead of the funeral home, and you've got the permit fees and crematory fees, so it's not inexpensive, but it's far less costly than a traditional funeral. And let me say, there's no reason that a traditional funeral need be extraordinary either in cost. You know, that we offer, all of us offer caskets in a wide range. There's more of us, and we never have offered real pricey caskets. There are a few, but people will talk about the high cost of funerals, but you know, ultimately, it's the consumer that dictates what that cost is. If the consumer is satisfied with not the most lavish casket or the most expensive vault, or not using limousines, and the funeral doesn't have to be extraordinarily expensive. So, cremation. With traditional funerals, I guess, and with cremations, the other trend has been not only with the increase of cremation, but the increase in personalization. We're a society that everything needs to be personalized. And with that, it's fancy memorial folders, it's extraordinary thank you notes, it's embellished obituaries in the newspaper. And all that happens at a price. Many times not, you know, anything that we dictate. But for instance, take an obituary, cremation or traditional. You know, the newspaper on this side of the river gives you 25 lines free. And you just be aware that the picture eats up some of that 25 lines. And then after that, it's $2.75 per line. So when you see some of these column-long obituaries, you just know that they're, you know, between $300 and $400 at least. And for some families, that's fine. I mean, that's not for me to judge. As I told the group this morning, mine is written. I will die first, is usually the case for us men. And if my wife changes my obituary, I will haunt her. And you've all heard it here. It's about this long, and it says who I am, when the services will be. Well, I haven't picked the date yet. I don't want to be too specific. It says when I was born, it says what I did, and it says who my survivors are. My theory is the people that know me know me. Those who want to know me, they can find out more. So I'm not putting down those who have written and crafted nice obituaries. I'm just saying, for me, that's enough. They're very creative. I was also asked this morning, who writes the obituary? Unfortunately, probably in 85% of the time we do. But if you see the long ones, it's either the family has written it, or probably my most hated situation is when a family will bring me in 5 sheets of handwritten in pencil paper and say, here's the obit, can you make something of this, and will you type it and email it to us to proof? And that's kind of hard. But we do it with a smile, Sometimes we get the A's and the O's mixed up and the I's and the E's, trying to decipher the handwriting. But that's probably one of the more difficult things that we have today, because the newspaper, gosh, when I started in 77, we would read the obituary over the phone to the obituary clerk at the newspaper. It was either Jeanette here at the Moline Dispatch, or it was Fran in Rock Island, or Elsie at WHBF on radio. But we would read the obituary, and they would type as we were reading, and really there were very few errors, and that's changed. So today the newspaper charges for the obit, but we're the ones that have to write it and email it. And if the family emails it, the newspaper will call us and confirm that the person's really died. And so if you're putting an obit in the paper for someone out of town, make sure that you know the funeral home out of town where that family, that service that family, because they will want to talk to that funeral home to confirm that the person really has passed away. So that's another chore, so to speak, of ours that people don't realize. So that's, when you think about it, whether it's traditional service or cremation, the funeral home is charged with gathering all the vital statistics, because it's our responsibility to type the death certificate, get it signed, to get the permits, to write the obituary, to confirm with the church or the minister who's doing the service, if we're going to the cemetery, to pass along those arrangements to the cemetery. Many times it's ordering flowers. So, there's a lot that happens. And I occasionally will be told, we'll have a college student or a high school student or somebody will job shadow for a day, and first thing they'll say, well, I didn't realize there was so much involved. It's not just that initial meeting. I mean, if there's a veteran, there's getting the veterans benefits and the burial flag, and it goes on and on and on.
Steve?
Yes.
I have a question about cremation.
Yes.
I was talking to someone this morning, in fact, it was a Lolly Kinshu, and I told her that we were coming over here for this, and she said, ask him about water cremation.
Water cremation. Hydrolysis. It's new, not offered in this area, offered in very, very few parts of the country. The technology is new. It's been used at some of the research hospitals. What it is, it's like a big cylinder, a little bit bigger than a torpedo tube, for anybody that's seen a torpedo tube. The body goes in there, and under pressure, a bleach, that's the best solution, the best way to describe it. A solution is placed around the body. The tissue is all eaten away, dissolved. What's left is bone fragment, which goes through a processor to get it down to the same size that cremains would be. It's basically very nearly the same cost as cremation. In some areas, it's actually a little bit more. I guess the biggest question we've got is, so what happens to all that dissolved?
Yeah.
So it goes in the sewer system.
Where does it go?
The sewer system. Yeah. And so that's the new, I don't see us doing that here. In fact, I'm trying to remember, I think Ohio was the first, there was a funeral home in Ohio that was the first to use it. And it was such an issue that the state had issue, the county had issue. It eventually went to court, and the Ohio Supreme Court ruled in favor of the funeral home. And so it's back in use, but there were so many people that had issues with it. I'm trying to remember if Mayo's might use that for people that are donated to their anatomical gift program and have used it for some time. I think it's Mayo's. Don't quote me on that. But that's the new technology. Yes, sir?
Is cremation governed by the weight of the person for the charge?
No. But people that are morbidly obese, it is an issue. There have been several crematories, funeral homes that have had fires because basically it's the oil in morbidly obese people, and it has created, there are issues with that. We've only been placed in that situation, I think, twice, and in both cases, a lot of precautions were taken. The charge was the same. Rungies probably wouldn't want me to tell you this, but they have their own retort, and I think twice they've had to call the fire department there. And in both cases, it's because it was a morbidly obese person. But those are very rare. I mean, very rare. And now they've learned how to take the precautions, so that's not an issue. Some crematories won't. I got asked this morning if we have our own retort. And when we built 2 of our 3 funeral homes, we're in Rock Island, Milan, and out in God's country in Reynolds, which I love to go to because nobody can find me when I'm there. In fact, there was one farmer that knew when I was there, and he'd come by in his tractor, and I actually saw he passed away a year or so ago, and I told his wife I miss Junior, because Junior would come by on the tractor if he saw my car in the parking lot and would stop by. Anyhow, we chose not to put retorts in. They're very pricey. Currently in Rock Island, which is not the case in any of the other communities, we have 3 basically. Chippewa Cemetery has one, and Wilbert Vault has 2. And when you are in business and you do your due diligence and you go out and make sure that they're operating properly, there's absolutely no reason for us to put one in. They're clean, safe environments. We know that they're taking extra care to make sure that the wrong body is not cremated and that there's no commingling of cremains afterwards. There's absolutely no reason for us to do it when we have people that are doing the job right. And I'd point out, especially Wilbert, for instance, we've had families that have said, we want visitation and want the body present, and then when the visitation's over, we want the body cremated so we can go to the cemetery directly after the funeral. So we've gone to the crematory at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and they've had the cremains back to us by 9:30 the next morning. With that kind of service, there's no reason for us to do that. And they charge you, because we don't add anything to that, they charge you $275. So why would we want to, for the actual cremation process, so why would we want to do our own? Yes?
Now, if you're a donor, where does all of that take place if you pass away at home?
If you're a donor,
An organ donor.
organ donor, good question. I've got to be careful because I don't want to sound like an anti-organ donor, because I'm not. There's 2 forms of donation, so we got to be clear on it. Organ donor meaning organs, specifically organ donor, heart, lungs, liver, kidneys. Very, very, very few people qualify. 10-15% of all deaths. So, what gets donated? Then we talk about tissue donation. That's really what we're talking about. So we want to be clear about that. Tissue donation, we're talking about bone, skin, maybe heart valves, if you qualify. But it's not the vital organs. So that's a completely different issue. If you die at home, few times that's happened where they've been interested. They want you to die in a hospital setting with a witness death, so that somebody is right there and can affirm the time of death and what you died of. There's We've had issues with tissue donation people not notifying us that the death has occurred till 18 hours later, and the family wanting to know why we haven't called them. You know, there's all kinds of side issues. We didn't get into that this morning, and maybe we should have. There is a state law, maybe it's federal law now, that when you die in a hospital, if you meet certain criteria before the body's released, the tissue donation people have to be notified. If the hospital does it right, they notify us anyhow and say, Mrs. Jones has died, but you can't come for the body yet. You'll be notified by Gift of Hope or whoever is handling the donation. The families, you aren't even told that you're going to be not released. Because the body's not released then until Gift of Hope has contacted the survivor to see if there's any interest in donating. If you don't answer your phone, or they don't have the right number, they don't release the body. So we had that happen 2 days in a row, where they held the body for 18, 20 hours. And after I screamed and screamed and screamed, in one case it didn't make a difference, in another it did. They realized they had the wrong number. And in the other case, the family wouldn't answer the phone because they didn't recognize the number. Both younger deaths. Many times when you die in the hospital, there's extenuating circumstances which don't mean you're not eligible. Running a fever, question of infection. But you know, you have to be clear that most cases, unless you're brain dead on a ventilator and you're at a younger age, they're not going to take any of the vital organs. We're talking skin and bone. If you die at home, I always tell folks, call your funeral director first and let him notify the court. If you're not a hospice case. Because today, if it's not a natural death, or even if it is a natural death at home, the tendency is to call 911. Well, they're obligated, even though you know the person has passed away, they're obligated to notify the ambulance. All of us, most of us are Moline or Rock Island. That means the ambulance comes, the fire trucks come, the police car comes, the detective comes, and they eventually, in the coroner, and so if there is a delay, I'll just tell you it's really not an issue on this side of the river. I mean, sure they all come, but they all leave and it's fine. In Iowa, since it's medical examiner, doctors treat this completely different. We had a lady who was 98 die at home. And the family called me. We knew she was going to pass away, but they weren't in hospice, didn't have visiting nurse. It was like the old days, like we did when my grandmother died. We took care of her at home. In fact, when my mother-in-law died, we didn't have outside help. We did that at home. So they called me, and I called the medical examiner that was on call, and she said, we really need to notify the police department yet. Not really? Yes. So I called the police department on their non-emergency number, and they said, well, you sure she's passed away? Yeah, she's 98. The family was with her. It probably happened an hour ago, and they're now ready for us to come. Okay, we'll send somebody out. Well, not only did they send the police, and the detective, and the ambulance, and the fire department, because they're separate agencies there, but the daughter told me later that night, when we were finally called, that not only did they show up, but the ambulance crew took the 98-year-old mother out of the bed, put her on the floor, and was getting ready to start resuscitating her. And they had a do not resuscitate, and she had been dead an hour. But, you know, we are so blessed here in Illinois. You wouldn't think you would be blessed and dying to be in Illinois. I mean, our governors might be all in prison, but, you know, if you die, you're going to be treated respectfully by the agencies that are called. So, I mean, that's a good question. And that happened here just a few weeks ago. Joe was 104 and lived alone. Neighbors kind of were looking after him and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his box of chocolate. passed away. Couldn't have been any sweeter, really. And, you know, they called us, I called the coroner went to the house, and, you know, there was nothing questionable about his death, and it was just handled very respectfully. And so, good question. You know, call your funeral home first. The funeral home will know how to handle it, and that's even if death occurs out of town. You know, call the local funeral home first and let him or her make the necessary arrangements with the authorities out of town. Because we have a nationwide service that we call that puts us in contact with somebody we can trust in that location. And if you're not having a service in Palm Beach or Miami or Sun City or wherever, we're going to talk to somebody that's going to treat you right, and there's not going to be exorbitant charges, especially if you want to come home to the Quad Cities. Let me talk about pre-planning, because I know that's an important question for all of you. Let me tell you, first of all, there isn't a funeral home in the Quad Cities, or probably worldwide, that doesn't do pre-planning. You know, as I said, it goes back to the days of pharaohs. Just like there isn't a funeral home in the Quad Cities that doesn't provide cremation. You know, that's some funeral homes have that in their sign now. Funeral home and cremation service. All of us provide cremation. So just because they advertise it doesn't mean that we don't provide it. Just because if you look in the yellow pages and don't see your funeral home listed under pre-planning doesn't mean they don't provide it. Everybody provides pre-planning. Pre-planning can be done in a couple of different scenarios. There are a number of people that will come in the funeral home and say, I want to pre-plan my funeral, but all I want you to have is my vital statistics. Or I want you to have my emergency contact. My kids will plan my service. And here's enough information for the death certificate. If you get called, here's who you need to be in contact with. That's all that happens. There's some families that take it a step further and say, not only do I want you to have that information, but I want you to know what I want. I want to be cremated. Or I want a service and I want this type of casket. I don't want the kids to spend much money, but I want a traditional service. I don't want to be cremated. So they come and pick out a casket. And then they may leave with that the music they like, favorite scripture readings. Some churches, and I don't know if Trinity does that, I should know, but we'll even keep a file at the church of the living saints' desires for music, and I thought they did. I thought that was my recollection. So the church has some idea of what your preferences are. And then the third step is that some people will prepay. Some people don't need to prepay because there is never going to be an issue of having funds. Some want to prepay because they want to lock in the cost, so it's not going to go up in price. When we prepay, for many years, most of us use trust. We're very regulated in Illinois. We're audited, we are, at least because of our size, are audited every year by the state. Most are audited every other year, some every third year, but we are what we are, so we get to see our auditor every year. And she's a nice lady, and she lets me know the day ahead she's coming, and so it's a good thing. We never have any issues, so it's a good thing. So we're audited. Trust funds, fewer of us are using the trust, just because we all know what bank rates have been, and CD rates have been, and they've not been good. And the whole idea with a prepaid funeral, at least from early on, was that if you prepaid, you never had to pay again. So if the funeral was $5,000 today, which they still were, you do too, that meant if at the time of death the funeral was now $7,000, going off the current price list, we would charge the trust the $7,000, because there's still things, part of that prepaid funeral we can't control. And so the trust would pay us $7,000. If there was an overage, the money would be refunded to the family. If there was an underage, you didn't know that because we had a guaranteed funeral with us and we assumed the loss. Well, for many years, many years, there was never a loss, never a loss. And we refunded money every funeral to families. Nothing makes you feel better than to be able to say, hey, you know that funeral that you pre-planned for $5,000, you know what? There's still plenty of money in the trust, and we're going to give you back a check for $1,000. And those days are gone, at least with trust. Do we charge families today because of a loss? Nope. If the family doesn't change anything, you should never ever be charged anything extra by your funeral director. Now, there's a key, because you could have a guaranteed funeral and you could have a non-guaranteed funeral. Guaranteed funerals meant that the funeral home was obligated to cover everything that was in that contract, irregardless of whether there was enough money in the trust to pay. If there was an overage, because the funeral home was at risk, they were not obligated to refund that money. But most of us that are prudent business people still refunded the money. There's also the non-guaranteed option. For years, we would use the non-guaranteed option for the simple reason that with a non-guaranteed option, if there was an overage, the funeral home was obligated by law to refund that money. And with the way the interest rates were and the CD rates, there was never ever a loss. We knew that we were going to have money to refund. We still have, lots of money in prearrangements. We have lots and lots of prearranged funerals. The least amount of that is in trust. We probably still have $1.5 million in the trust fund. Now held locally, I'm happy to say, at Quad City Bank and Trust, and they do a wonderful job. Trust Department administrates those funds. They are our third-party fiduciary that handles that. We do have a good number of non-guarantees. There are losses on those non-guarantees, but I can only speak for us. We have never charged a family for something if they haven't changed the prearrangement. There have been losses for us, especially on the non-guaranteed side, and we've still recognized that. And why? Because I've always felt that families, especially mature folks that come in and prepay, no matter how you expect this or explain that, they understand that it's prepaid, whether you use the word guaranteed or you use the word non-guaranteed. In their mind, they never are going to have to pay a thing. And some of them have even asked for the non-guaranteed. But being the business person that at least I am, and I hope my peers are, because that's how they understand it, that's how we treat it. Is still a guarantee. So we have recognized losses, especially in the last couple of years. So do we still use the trust for new prearrangements? No. When the rates started going down 5 or 6 years ago, many of us switched to life insurance. And so we use a company out of Des Moines, Iowa, that was created, I should know this, 60, 70 years ago, only to handle insurance for prepaid funerals. It's called Homesteaders. It's a large company. It's rated A- or A by the Best Corporation. But it's a company where the CEO will, out of the blue, call and say, so how's it going out in the field, Steve? How are our prearrangements holding up? Are there any issues? And for a number of years, we were, we have a great lady that handles our prearrangements, and we were number 1 or number 2 in the nation as far as all their pre-need in their company. So maybe that's why he called. But I can say that the losses with insurance have been nil, 1 or 2%. We break even many times. But now, for those families that were early when we switched to them 6, 7 years ago, we're starting to give money back to families. In fact, I think we had a family last week that we had a $1,200 or $1,500 surplus that we paid back to them. So we've got to be clear. The clear part is that your pre-need funeral, again, let's go back to the $5,000 figure. Whatever, we're just using that figure. I don't care what the form of disposition is. $5,000 a funeral. When you die, we're obligated almost to charge what the price is at the current day. Because many times the casket's gone up, or if it's cremation, the crematory's gone up, the permits have gone up, some have included everything else has gone up. So we charge what the current day price is. But because that insurance has also increased every year, that's why you get the refund. And I am just so happy to get people back, as I said. Yes?
What happens if you prepay your plan, and let's say you sold a business? What happens to that money or?
Good question. Whether it's in trust or insurance, and let's hope with us starting our 125th year that we're going to be around a few more years, that the money is still held in that person's name. It's just changed recently. I mean, we've gone through a couple crises with the trust over the years, but we're now under federal law. Let me back up. For years, because the trust was held in the individual's client, they would get a 1099 every year. Because even though the funeral home was the beneficiary of the trust, they were paying interest on the funds held in that trust, the client was. And many didn't like, we'd get calls about that. And after the first couple of years, they kind of realized, okay, I understand that we're paying the interest on the trust, but it's their money, it's not ours. So if we went out of business, it's still their money in the bank. They could move it to a transfer to another funeral home, they could do whatever they wanted. Similarly, with insurance, it's completely transferable to another funeral home. It's only payable to the funeral home once the funeral home can demonstrate that they provided the funeral. And we have that. People that move here, mature people that have moved to Florida and then have decided, I shouldn't use Florida because that's not a good state. In Florida, the funeral home can hang on to all the interest. You buy a $5,000 funeral there and you move to another state, the funeral home can hang on to the $5,000 in interest. And the only thing you can take is the principal when you go. That's not a good. Florida's I think the only state that does that. Go to another warm state like Arizona and you decide to move home, we've had people come back in and transfer it back to us. And the only issue is if that funeral home's prices were significantly different, there might be a difference. Fortunately, most cases, we're right on or less, so it's not been an issue. Somebody else had a question, I think.
What if you move the other way? Suppose you leave Rock Island and you move, or Moline.
Again, completely transferable.
Out of state and everything.
Yep. Just if that funeral home will accept it. And we've not had issues, especially with homesteaders, because most companies, the only time you get an issue there is that company called SCI, the Dignity Company, which is corporate, owns funeral homes all over the United States. Quad Cities, there's only two, Hodson's and Rock Island and Rungy's and Davenport, that are not independently owned. They are governed by what happens in Houston, Texas. And so if you go to a Dignity funeral home, wherever it is in the country, they may not accept it. Let me stop there for just a minute too and say, and it's something that unfortunately we didn't get to this morning, with pre-need, the other thing that happens is we'll have families that will come in, especially if an aged parent, I don't see anybody aged in this group, that will have all kinds of life insurance. And many of us, me included, were in a generation that actually believed that some life insurance was good. So what they'll do is, we don't need to prepay. I've got insurance. Or mom or dad is in a nursing facility and the child comes in and says, we don't need to prepay, mom or dad has life insurance. Some people are not in the situation where they have enough other assets for an extended time being in some kind of care center. I guess let's just say nursing home, where they start outliving their expenses. My mother, who died just about a year ago, was in a nursing center for 6 or 8 months. Of course, Medicare, since she was only in for that long, Medicare paid part of it, but then it was $6,000 a month for her care. It doesn't take long to start going through those funds, especially if you're there for any length of time. So the families think we're still fine. Mom or dad has life insurance, but now the other assets are starting to go. So we need to go to the Department of Human Services, Public Aid in the state of Illinois, and need to get them qualified for the state to come in and help start taking care of their care. You'd be surprised how many people are in nursing homes with state assistance. We all think we're not going to be there. You'd be surprised how many are. So then the family goes and they plan their funeral, or they get their parent on public aid, and they think they're going to make that life insurance payable to the funeral home. Well, state law says, one, you can't make the funeral home beneficiary. Although the Department of Insurance 12 years ago reversed that rule and said, if it's part of a prepaid burial fund, yes, the funeral home can be beneficiary. 99.9% of the insurance companies won't allow it internally. So, what's the next option? Well, we'll make it assignable to the funeral home. We'll use what's called a durable power, or I don't want to misstate this, an irrevocable assignment or a revocable assignment to the funeral home. And the only way the funeral home will get paid is if the funeral home demonstrates that they provided the service. If they can't provide that, even though it's assigned to the funeral home, they're not going to get paid. Okay, the insurance company says, we'll do that. But then the state of Illinois comes back and says, well, the only way we're going to recognize that is if it's an irrevocable assignment to the funeral home. Hello? 99.9% of the insurance companies won't recognize irrevocable assignments. So what's that mean? These folks who have paid on life insurance for years have a death value of, we'll say $10,000. They have to cash it in for $5,000 because the state of Illinois isn't going to do both. And you don't know what anguish children go through when, and they look at you and they absolutely don't believe us when we say it. And then they get the letters from the state saying, we're not going to accept this. You got to cash in. Either cash in the life insurance your mom or dad's off public aid, and you can do private pay at the nursing home. And so it's gotten to be a real issue. So all of our pre-needs we do now with insurance. It says right on it, it's irrevocable. If it's irrevocable, the state of Illinois approves it. So that's another issue we have. Kids that will come walking in the funeral home will have funeral lined up, parking lot is packed, and somebody will come in and say, I got to do this pre-arrangement right now. I got to get this money spent because we're putting our mom on public aid this afternoon. And she's got this money in her bank, and we got to get it out of there now because it's considered an exempt asset. So many people think funeral homes have pushed the whole idea of pre-arrangements. A lot of times it's the caseworkers in the nursing homes. If they're a good caseworker, they'll say to the family, I see down here, it doesn't look like your parent is going to get out of here in 4 or 5 months. You've only got 4 or 5 months of assets left. You better get in and get some of this taken care of. Let me jump to one other subject that I want to talk about. And then I have no time constraints, so if you have questions, we'll do that. And I wished I could have heard Mark Schwiebert speak last week, and I don't know if he covered this or not. Power of attorney for health care. Important, 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 important. Power of attorney for health care. Why do I think it's important? I'm the undertaker. You're past health care when you get to me. If you are, say that your spouse has passed away, and you are here alone, who makes your funeral arrangements? Well, there's one child that lives here, or there's one child you look to, so that child comes in to make funeral arrangements, but there are 3 or 4 siblings. You have 5 children. By law, that one child cannot make funeral arrangements. Technically, power of attorney ceases at the time of death. There's no executor. That can take weeks, or a week or 2 until we get, so there is not one, but in the state of Illinois, it's a peculiar state, and power of attorney for health care on the generic form, and I apologize, I forgot to bring one. Paragraph A or B, it says, this power of attorney does not cease at death unless noted further in paragraph D, and it allows the grantor, gives right to the grantee, however it's written, the right to control the disposition at the time of death, including autopsy, donation, and is not limited unless stated otherwise. Then there'll be another sentence. This power of attorney also grants the right for the person, the grantee, whoever, to make final arrangements, to control the disposition of the body, including, the new form will say, cremation, and it binds the funeral home or their representative to follow your wishes. Now, this 105-year-old man we just talked about, no family. The family came in the week before, or the neighbors who were looking after him came in the week before and said, he wanted to be cremated. I said, you don't have that authority right now. Yeah, we do. No. Nowhere does it say in that power of attorney for health care that you have the right to control the disposition of the remains. Well, we're going to call our attorney. Well, they called the attorney, and the attorney said, no, that's right. And I said, no, it's not. I said, pulled my copy out, I gave it to him. They went to the attorney, and the attorney said, we've never seen that form before. That's a great form. It's been around for years. You go to Trinity Medical Center and ask them for their generic copy of power of attorney, and it's right there that it says that it grants the person the right to designate who they want to control disposition. Cremation is really significant. Traditional, it's not so bad. But if you are childless and spouseless, and you've got 6 siblings, all 5 or 6 of those siblings have to sign off on that cremation, no matter where they live, unless you have that designated person, that designated signer on your power of attorney for health care. We just had a family the other day, 8 kids, 5 of them not living here, 1 of them in federal penitentiary. So it took us, you talk about that time delay of cremation, because we have to wait the 24 hours, get the death certificate signed, get the permits from the coroner, get the permits from the county. So we're at day 2 or day 3, but we still got to wait to get authorizations from the other 2 who live. One lives in California, one lives in Vermont, and the one is in prison. So we are a very regulated society today. Funeral homes, everybody thinks they're the most regulated, but there's so many hoops that we have to jump through. People say, well, things are expensive today. It's expensive to die. It's expensive to live. But you don't know how much time it takes today for us to take care of what seems to be the simplest arrangement suddenly becomes the most involved arrangement. You know, I'd like to, yeah, go ahead, Norm.
Last week I asked Mark for this, about this power of attorney, whether that would most likely be the spouse. But you must deal with situations where people fortunately have lived long together, and now it's time to make a key decision, and the surviving spouse may or may not have all the capabilities, but it's
Exactly.
still there. If you find that many situations where
Exactly.
the PA is in fact given ahead of time, quite a few years ahead of time, to one of the offspring, the next generation. Mark seemed to say that most of the time it's going to stay the spouse. What's your experience with that?
Absolutely not. You know, I just talked about the 105-year-old man. Read the obits. How many 90-some-year-olds do we see in the obituaries, and there is no spouse? So the power of attorney of healthcare is one of the children.
Oh, yeah, okay, but I'm saying, yeah, he indicated you'd have a secondary.
Oh, right.
I see. This is assuming the spouse is still alive, but at that point,
Not capable.
all right, the spouse is the survivor. The guy's died at age 92. The spouse is 90. She's the survivor. Would one still have a 90-year-old survivor or the 65-year-old son or daughter be the PA to make the tough decisions in a tough time?
Well, and that's a tough question. I mean, that's when you go to the attorney. I mean, all of us, I think, put our spouse as the designated representative under the power of attorney, but we always usually have a deputy there to function in that case if our spouse can. So, you know, I think you're right.
You mean, like if you have family, it could be whichever you specify.
Oh, sure, yeah, and we see that a lot. You know, and luckily, in our case, the 105-year-old man was sharp enough to do a new power of attorney of healthcare several weeks before he passed away. And it was the right one, so we had no issues. And you know, people look at you, really, when you bring these things up to them, especially at need. Oh, what do you mean I can't sign a cremation authorization, right? Or they go to the cemetery, and the cemetery says, well, you can't sign these forms, you're not a legal representative.
My take on this one was that, I think Mark was suggesting going too deep to get into your standard form, probably go with 1 week.
No.
As a grantee.
No.
By working with attorneys, you can get it written so that you have the deputy.
Yeah, there is most of them have that. You know, everything is, as I understand it, attorneys all have those loaded on their computer now, and they just put in the names and print them out. And most of them I see does include a deputy line. And again, I wish I'd have heard Mark's presentation. I think the dilemma occurs, and maybe he addressed this, and maybe you were here and can help me, is when somebody, and you're told not to do this, on a power of attorney for healthcare, have 2 people of equal value being your representative, and that's not good. And,
Mark said that too.
yeah.
I want to ask about, recently I have heard that if you have signed a power of attorney for healthcare when you're in the hospital, that in actuality, when the situation occurs, that doesn't always stand up, and that you really need to have this signed through a law office with a lawyer and not at the hospital.
I've
Because
not
they
heard
can just
that.
throw that out and not use that one if it's not been through a lawyer. Do you know?
I've been always told it was accurate, because nothing is more important than your health care. And if the hospital can make life or death decisions based on it, then how could a court not uphold its value?
Okay, I just wondered about that.
Yeah.
Because,
You know, we had one that was done by the attorney, by my parents, and after my dad died, and when Mom suddenly got ill, we looked at it and found that that probably wasn't the best instrument, and used the hospital one, and then never had an issue for several years later. So now, there's a difference. If you're talking about power of attorney for healthcare and power of attorney for finances, I wouldn't have anything done for finances but by an attorney. But for healthcare, if the hospital uses it, I mean, nobody else is gonna question it. We certainly wouldn't.
The reason I ask is my mother-in-law was recently told that the power of attorney that she signed at the hospital at the time of her husband's illness, and that they both signed, that she was just told by a lawyer that that won't stand up, or especially if something happened to you out of state, if you weren't in your home state. And, you know, she was told she needed to.
I hadn't heard that.
Okay.
But that's, maybe I should ask that question.
Well,
Maybe I will ask that
wondering
question.
about where things stand.
Yeah.
For myself.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, because I will check into that, because I don't know. I've never heard that, you know.
It sounds rather illogical, doesn't it? The hospitals have these forms for that precise reason, right?
Yeah.
Why would a hospital say that it's illogical for you to sign while you're in our building?
Yeah, I don't understand that, yeah.
Steve, what is the difference between a living will and power of attorney for healthcare?
Good question. Living will, really, and again, I'm not an attorney, gonna tell you that. So whoever attorney's watching this on tape, I'm not an attorney. Living will, my understanding of living will, you're expressing your desires for whether you want to be kept alive or not kept alive, hydrated or not hydrated, artificial means of respiration, those type of things. But if you were to die or have some cardiac event, not die, but have a cardiac event, and you're being resuscitated and you go to the hospital and they've got you in a respirator, the living will tells them what you want, but it gives nobody authority to pull the plug. And that's why you need somebody designated on your power of attorney for healthcare to make those critical decisions, not to end life necessarily, but say you need open heart surgery. You know, living will says I don't want to be kept alive, but yet you still need somebody to designate what you want. Now, part of a power of attorney for healthcare, there are those same questions that a living will asks. Do I want to be kept alive? Do I want to be hydrated? Do I want to be pain-free? Those type of things are on the power of attorney for healthcare, but it's giving somebody the right to make those decisions on your behalf. Living will just tells them what you want, but it doesn't give anybody the right to enforce those requests. Yeah.
So you need both.
I think, I think some people would argue that the living will has kind of fallen by the wayside because of the power of attorney for healthcare really covers both. It plus gives somebody the authority to act on it. Isn't it scary when an undertaker knows all this? Really, I want y'all to live. There's nothing wrong with cheating the undertaker. I see no problem with that at all.
Describe the relationship between you and the cemeteries and the choice of that, and who people do that separately, or?
Most, if you didn't hear Dr. Moline, he's asking about our relationship with the cemeteries. Tenuous some days. Not really. We get along with all the cemeteries. Really, it's the client needs to go to the cemetery themselves and make choices about, you know, cemetery lot or urn garden or whatever they're looking at. In Rock Island and Moline, there isn't a bad cemetery. There are some that are a little bit harder to work with and are very expensive, and it's all about dollars and cents. And in Rock Island and Moline, you would not find that. They've become very regulated too, so there's more paperwork involved, and that's all because of Chicago, and we all read the story where they were finding bodies scattered around the cemetery that were being buried. Well, now it's become pretty regulated. And obviously we've not had any issues in, you know, again, in Rock Island or Moline with malfeasance or, you know, yeah. But they're really all very good. Yes?
I got a two-part question.
Can I decide which part I want to answer?
Real quick. Is there a difference price between a wooden casket and a metal?
There are. I think there's a bigger range in price, let's put it that way. There's a larger range in price between the metals and the woods. You can find an inexpensive wood will be about the same price as a mid-level wood, or a mid-level steel, and an inexpensive wood are about the same. They tend to start a little more expensive.
And secondly, buried at the arsenal, now do they put the whole casket in the ground with the vault?
Yes. National Cemetery currently offers, of course, the grave for the veteran and their spouse, the monument, and a burial container. We don't refer to them as vaults because they're not lined. I mean, that's a industry description. What the arsenal has now is they have pre-buried, they're almost like catacombs, pre-buried burial containers. So the first person, they go out to the section, say you don't want a vault, you want a free container from the cemetery. Nothing wrong with them, believe me. You go out, they go to the spot, they dig down a few feet, they lift off a lid, they reach down, pick off the second lid, the first one goes down at the bottom, they put that lid on, they put the top back lid on and rebury it. So they're all pre-buried. We used to call them lawn crypts. All that's provided free of charge. So technically, unless for some reason you want a private vault, a sealed vault, everything's free over there. And in fact, if you buy a private vault, the government currently rebates back to you $190 of that cost. They send a check back to the family. And also at the National Cemetery now, most people seem surprised unless you're over into the western part of the cemetery, they also have what's called a columbarium or a niche wall. So if you're cremated and you choose not to have your cremains buried, they can go into this beautiful wall that has a marble front on it. And there's room for two in each one of those little niches. Other questions?
What does it cost for the caskets and stuff like that, if you just want to borrow?
How much they cost? I think at our funeral home they start at $900 and go up to maybe $4,000.
Is that borrowing them?
Pardon?
That's borrowing them?
Oh no, the borrowing one, the inexpensive rental casket, I think the casket and the liner together are about $1,200.
I have it on my will that with my two kids are in charge of. Now there's another kid, but I took two kids in case they don't always get along. And
That's normal.
That's who I was going to have them, to decide on my funeral. Now, is that right?
I'd also have it, none of us think that our kids aren't not going to get along. But the only problem with putting it in your will, I mean, that they will take care of your financial things. But the will isn't filed with the court until a death certificate has been filed, which means somebody has to make funeral arrangements. So legally, the executors, most cases, aren't appointed until long after the funeral has been.
So what do they do then?
Then that's why you need to have somebody on that power of attorney for health care.
And if I don't have that?
It's easy to get.
I know it's easy.
And they're not expensive. Because we see that occasionally, we have seen that, where somebody is named under the will as to be in charge of the funeral. Well, either A, you can't get to the will because it's locked up, so nobody knows who's in charge, or you have to wait till it's been probated, till it's been lodged against the court for that person to actually be named. Now, if everybody gets along, it's not a problem. I mean, I've had that happen a lot, where there's 3 siblings, and they'll say, well, Sarah's going to be the one that's in charge, and as long as they all get along, it's not a problem. Anything else? Yeah.
I was just going to say something about her wondering and they hold up the power of that.
Yeah.
In 25 years, I've never seen that it did. The important thing is to have it signed by yourself while you're still mentally able to, and then to have a witness.
Thank you.
And then they really don't question. I've never been anyone that question it.
I had to do this one.
I'd like to end, and then I can stick around for a few minutes if anybody has questions. But I have this whole theory that what funeral services is, maybe I said this, so if I did, I'm sorry. We're really a shared ministry. I mean, we all have our own vocations, and I really believe that it's not dollars and cents, but it's about service, it's about relationship, and it's about ministry. And I preach that to the other 6 funeral directors that are on our staff, whatever form that takes. And I would like to think most of the funeral homes feel that way. But the relationship we have with the pastors is wonderful. You know, the only way we survive this, I think, because we're put in an awful, tremendous situation sometimes. A rabbi once said, at a funeral service here, whether this is his thought or he bought it from someone, I don't know, but that as we're born, there's hands to receive us. And as we die, there are a different set of hands to receive us. And let me end with this. It's called the parable of the twins. And if you want copies, maybe somebody will be able to copy it for you. I know several of the people copied it this morning, but this is what I believe. Once upon a time, twin boys were conceived in the same womb. Weeks passed and the twins developed. As their awareness grew, they laughed for joy. Isn't it great that we were conceived? Isn't it great to be alive? Together the twins explored their world. When they found their mother's cord that gave them life, they sang for joy. How great is our mother's love that she shares her own life with us. As weeks stretched into months, the twins noticed how much each was changing. What does it mean? Asked the one. It means that our stay in this world is drawing to an end, said the other. But I don't want to go, said the other one. I want to stay here always. We have no choice, said the other. But maybe there is life after birth. But how can there be? Responded the one. We will shed our life cord, and how is life possible without it? Besides, we have seen evidence that others were here before us, and none of them have returned to tell us that there is a life after birth. No, this is the end. And so the one fell into deep despair, saying, if conception ends in birth, what is the purpose of life in the womb? It's meaningless. Maybe there is no mother after all. But there has to be, protested the other. How else did we get here? How do we remain alive? Have you ever seen our mother? Said the one. Maybe she lives only in our minds. Maybe we made her up because the idea made us feel good. And so the last days in the womb were filled with deep questioning and fear. Finally, the moment of birth arrived. When the twins had passed from their world, they opened their eyes. They cried, for what they saw exceeded their fondest dreams. 1 Corinthians says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it so much as dawned on man what God has prepared for those who love him. I think we're all prepared, aren't we? We strive to be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.